Hello, and welcome to Ipsy Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm Ben Edwards, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William S. Boyd School of Law. My guest is Hilary J. Allen, Associate Professor of Law at American University, Washington College of Law. We will discuss her article, Driverless Finance, which is forthcoming in the Harvard Business Law Review. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ben.
Hello. Glad to have you. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been reading your work for a few years now, and it's had a huge influence on how I think and write about these issues and how I just see what's happening in the space. This is a paper you presented at Law and Society in Washington, D.C. recently, and I had the pleasure of seeing you present it. And I'm so glad you have the vision and the foresight to be thinking about these issues and talking about them now when we still have the time to do things. So you framed the issue really well with the term driverless finance. Like, why'd you pick this term? What are we talking about here?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words, Ben. If you've been following my work for years, you've seen me trying to scare people for years about all the different things that could send our financial system into a tailspin. And the thing that I'm...
And you're right.
What?
And you are right.
Well, I mean, hopefully I'm wrong, but I fear that I am right. And the thing that is keeping me up at night at the moment is this concept of driverless finance, as I call it. So what I mean by that is sort of the next iteration of financial decision-making that's made not really by humans using computers, but by artificial intelligence. The most sophisticated autonomous algorithms that we're seeing evolve now, that these are going to sort of qualitatively change the way that financial decision-making is being made. And I use the term driverless finance to draw a parallel with driverless cars, and it's not just a gimmick. The thing that people who are regulating driverless cars are most worried about are what the tech people call edge cases, right? Unanticipated events. And when we're talking about financial stability and financial crises, the thing that we're most worried about are what economists call tail events, right? And they're the same kind of things. They're things that are unanticipated. And all of this technology that's being developed now works better than humans most of the time. But when it comes across these edge cases or these tail events, it's incredibly unpredictable how it will react. And it could do so in ways that are just, beyond the pale. We don't know what could happen.
Right. So we actually have these driverless cars on the streets of Las Vegas right now. And I don't know if they picked our jurisdiction because we tend to
make things
value freedom. Or sort of there's a very light regulatory burden in the state, or because we produce a lot of edge cases in the sense that there's all sorts of unpredictable things coming down the streets here. But when we think about mapping that over to finance, what's the worst case scenario with the driverless car? Like what are we talking about in terms of damage?
So, I think the thing that everybody is afraid of is, that there could be a car crash and a pedestrian could be killed or a driver could be killed, or worst case, a few car pileups. And I've been in classrooms talking about technology and regulation where I've asked, people to put up their hands and say, who'd be willing to drive in it or ride in a driverless car? And I'm usually the only person to put their hand up, which may have something to do with the fact that I actually never learn to drive. So I think these sound amazing. But most people are scared about these, but people are not scared about driverless finance. And I think there's such a visceral picture that we get when we think about car crashing.
Right. But it's like a plane crash.
Exactly. But then think about what happens when the financial system goes down. It may seem a little sort of more abstract, but if you think back to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, worldwide economic devastation, and that does translate into loss of life. There were medical studies saying that the rate of heart attacks went through the roof, the rate of suicides went through the roof. This is something we should be terrified of.
We should. We're in some sense we're a little bit statistically blind. Like if you increase the risk in the environment and it's spread out, people treat it differently or think you should regulate differently than if it's a car crash you can see.
I think that's really right. And, there's all kinds of issues from a legal perspective of showing causation when it comes to financial crises, whose fault was it? And then, to sort of jump into later in the program, it's going to be a lot harder to show who caused the problem when we start delegating decision making to algorithms. But back to your point, because it's sort of diffuse, it's not just one actor, it's a complex system that's malfunctioning. I think it is harder to get people to focus on it, to worry about it, to try and develop regulatory solutions. But I think that's really short-sighted given that the harm that can be caused.
Oh, it's enormous. So the risks here seem to be expanding because we're seeing more and more financial services become essentially driverless. Like what areas is it expanding into right now? Like what are we seeing?
So a lot of different areas. I think, when most people think about algorithms and financial decision making, they're probably thinking about high frequency trading, which was, the subject of Michael Lewis's book, Flash Boys. Everybody got really excited about it. But that's almost sort of passé in terms of what we're talking about now. Most of the algorithms that were used for high frequency trading were predictive in the sense that they were actually programmed by a programmer to do a certain thing.
Right.
What we're seeing now is artificial intelligence, particularly this type of artificial intelligence that they call machine learning, where they literally just give the algorithm a set of data and say, have at it, draw what lessons and conclusions you will from the data that we're providing to you. So in terms of where that's being applied, people are very excited about using it in the context of Robo Advisory. Right. So Robo Advisory is a sort of an umbrella term. And I should say, with all these things in fintech, none of these terms or definitions are precise. People have different things they
different views about it. Oh, yeah.
So it does get a little confusing, but you can think of Robo Advisory as sort of an umbrella term for any situation where a computer is giving advice to a consumer about a financial product. So, we see it in insurance, we're starting to see it in banking, but it's perhaps most noticeable in the field of financial advice in terms of investing. And so robo-investment is a term that you'll often hear.
Like a Wealthfront, Betterment. I think they have...
Exactly. Yep, those ones. Wealthfront and Betterment.
16 billion between those two firms under assets under management. So they're getting bigger and bigger, and they're growing every day.
Yeah, and they have ambitions to replace, general human financial advisors. And in many respects, there are great things about them. They are, much cheaper and much more efficient. So in terms of accessibility, that is great.
Basis points. I think they're at 15 basis points, right? So 0.15%. Where if you want, someone from Wells Fargo to manage your money, they're going to charge you 2.25%
of your assets under management. Yeah. That's right. And so, that is, at least on the face of it, a really good thing. And that's another, I think, reason why people have not engaged with the problems of driverless finance, because the upsides seem so great, right? Democratizing the financial services. But let's think a little more about what it means if we're going to have an algorithm, particularly a machine learning algorithm, artificial intelligence, decide what individual investors should invest in. Okay. So
what happens if, so it's one thing if this is happening with a small percentage of the market. $17 billion is an enormous amount of money, but relative to the, I think, like $7.5 trillion we have in 401ks right now, it's not that much.
And I think that's an important point. Another reason why people aren't worried about driverless finance too much at the moment is because of scale. You're right. This is not a huge portion of the market. But I think the trend lines are that it will become increasingly important. And even the Wells Fargos of the world will start to use this technology. And so what this technology means in the sort of the robo investment context is that an algorithm will be given voluminous sets of data about market movements, and it will decide what is a good portfolio based on those data sets. Sorry, sometimes I say data, sometimes I say data. I grew up in Australia. It's very confusing.
It happens.
All right, but let's think about the data or the data that we're using, right? Most of the data that's around in the world has only been around for a couple of years.
Right.
So if, and these robo investment services pride themselves on not just looking at strict market data, but they're looking at all kinds of data about, how humans behave, et cetera, et cetera. But if their data only goes back a couple of years, the data has only ever seen essentially an economic expansion.
Right.
Has no idea what a downturn looks like, let alone a crisis. Right. So you have to query how accurate this, these investment, the advice that comes out of these robo advisory firms is going to be. And even if they're right, just think about the correlation implications of this. Instead of having, a bunch of human financial advisors making decisions about what people should invest in, when they should buy and when they should sell, we have just a few algorithms, right? It's all about economies of scale. We have a few algorithms making these decisions. And sure, they may adjust portfolios depending on people's risk characteristics, but still they're going to sort of see people as a sort of a monolithic people into buckets, I think. And so we're going to see much more monolithic activity in the market. So the bubbles and the busts that we have seen in the past may be dwarfed by future bubbles and busts when we have just a few algorithms making all the recommendations about when to buy and when to sell.
Right. So if these robo firms eventually end up with control over just an enormous amount of assets, even if they're wrong on the merits, it would be so hard to take a meaningful short position against them and change the way the market looked in a bubble, just simply because of the amount of assets they'll control.
I think that's right. And if we bring up Michael Lewis again, if we learn nothing less from The Big Short, there's very little difference between being wrong and having your timing wrong. You can be right at the wrong time and it'll bankrupt you. So, and none of this is predictable. So I don't think short positions are an effective sort of systemic risk hedge against what these robo algorithms are coming up with.
So if we're concerned about wealth concentrations in individual hands, we should also be concerned about it concentrating in algorithmic hands.
Exactly, writ on a larger scale than we could potentially imagine.
So the ways these things are changing markets, it's not just potentially narrowing the number of sort of, can I say cognitive processes going into making trading decisions, but also the speed with which trading is going to be happening and assets are going to be reallocated.
Yeah, that's right. I think speed is a real issue. We've already started to see speed being an issue in the high frequency trading context. But as I said, this is a sort of almost next generation. And one place where I'm particularly worried about speed is in the context of smart contracts. So when we talk about sort of smart contracts now as financial assets, we're typically talking about tokens in the ICO world. And, they're the Wild West of finance, the little crazy, people are using them to speculate. So again, I don't see any real systemic implications there yet.
No, we're talking about maybe $7-8 billion a year in economic activity in that sector.
Yeah, it's just not that big. But I really think that the more established financial markets will find it hard to resist the siren call of smart contracts. This idea that you could have everything baked into a computer program that doesn't leave any time for intervention. Because again, there are a lot of benefits to that. You take away a lot of uncertainty, you add a lot of efficiency. So I should back up. If you're not familiar with smart contracts, what these are basically, these are algorithms. And these are algorithms that are hosted on some kind of blockchain. And if they receive instructions, that will actually just carry out the contract. So if you say,
I got an example for you. So I got an example for you that I want to check in with you about. So imagine we wanted to make a bet on the outcome of the NHL championship. So we know
let's go.
St. Louis won last night.
Okay.
And we could set our bet up to where we put the money in the smart contract. And if you bet on St. Louis, you get the money. And if the other team won, I got the money.
Okay.
And we would we would tie our smart contract to ESPN's website. And so if ESPN updated and said St. Louis won, you got the money.
So in that context, and I like this terminology, the ESPN website would be known as the Oracle.
Yes. So the Oracle, is this, whatever result comes from this triggers the smart contract. Now, imagine they have an intern entering, the scores, and they sort of fat finger or enter the wrong information, and it comes up that the other team won. The smart contract would trigger, and I would get the money, even though it was a mistake. And how would we unwind that?
Well, and the important thing to note about that is, how would you actually get the money? Right. So what this would actually be is that there would be some kind of distributed ledger, kind of like a blockchain. If for those of you familiar with Bitcoin, there are all kinds of distributed ledgers. The one that we're using right now for smart contracts a lot is the Ether blockchain, but who knows what it will be in the future. It's just an accounting ledger that's hosted on the cloud effectively.
Right.
And so on that accounting ledger, there would be a notation that says that you, Ben Edwards, have this an account, and I, Hilary Allen, have this other account. And depending on what happens with the Oracle, money will transfer to either your account or to my account. And once that happens, there is no mechanism for undoing it. So think of the speed at which we'll start to see financial contracts executed if they start to be embodied in this way, right? They'll be so fast. And if there is a mistake, as you say, if there's an intern, and frankly, we shouldn't blame the interns. Lots of us,
I make mistakes like this all the time.
Exactly. So let's not, so say a very senior ESPN editor put in the wrong information. So say someone very senior at an Oracle gets the information wrong. Well, that's going to affect the transaction, and I'm using effect in the EFFECT. It's going to carry out the transaction without any time for human judgment, even if all the parties involved know it was a mistake. Right. There's no mechanism for undoing it. Now, we have seen that, in fact, there can be a mechanism for undoing it, but it's unwieldy, and it's not how these things are supposed to work. Right. You essentially have to fork the distributed ledger. You have to create an alternative distributed ledger where that transaction never happened. But you've got to get everybody on board. All the people who are in charge of maintaining that distributed ledger have to get on board to change the transaction. And that can be, in some circumstances, impossible. It may not be possible to identify people, or they may be beyond your reach jurisdictionally, or at the very least, it's going to be time consuming, and the damage may already have been done if the transaction has already been carried out.
So for something that's going to work for humans and human society, we're going to need some way to fix problems like that as things go along. How do we get there? What would be different than what we have right now with sort of the Bitcoin protocol?
Sure. So I think, the Bitcoin protocol just simply isn't going to work for mainstream transactions. So what I've argued for in this paper is that there has to be, if we want these smart contracts to represent mainstream assets,
right,
there has to be some kind of requirement, and now I'm sort of jumping forward to my regulatory solutions part of the paper, but there has to be some requirement that any distributed ledger that hosts mainstream financial assets be maintained by people who can be contacted, who will be amenable to undoing the transaction, to forking the distributed ledger, if it's clear to everyone that there was a mistake made, and that those people should be able to act on very short notice,
right,
to get it undone. Now, it's not a perfect solution, but it's better than what we currently see. What we currently see with these distributed ledgers is that they are by design complicated, or too impossible to change. Right.
Then, so their immutability is one of the selling points.
Exactly. If you think of sort of Bitcoin in many respects as a libertarian fever dream, right? That this idea that no one can undo it, no government, no courts that was the selling point of the distributed ledger technology. That just doesn't seem to me to be compatible with sort of mainstream financial assets. I think what we'll see is that to the extent that this technology goes mainstream, it will be on distributed ledgers that are maintained by more permissioned nodes. But I think the market itself, the private sector, will not require distributed ledgers that can be undone in a way that I think we need them to be able to be undone from a regulatory perspective to avoid these crises.
So we have these new distributed ledger systems that are coming on, and we also have machine learning and artificial intelligence moving assets on these blockchains.
Right, they're linked together.
So it's the combination of them that potentially shifts things. And so if we're delegating more and more decisions to these algorithms, what are the risks here? Are we deferring too much?
Well, I think so. I mean, part of the problem is that we humans don't have a particularly good track record with financial risk management ourselves.
No. Australia's better, but on the whole, we've had a hard time.
It's kind of the pot calling the kettle black. But I think this automation of financial decision making will probably actually work better than humans most of the time.
Oh yeah.
But algorithms just don't make sense of the world in the same way we do. And I think when these edge cases, these tail events come up, I think that's when we could start to see really scary things. And you could ask me what those scary things are. And the fact of the matter is, I just don't know. Yeah. Right? We have such a complex system. How will they behave? What will they do? That's unpredictable. Right. How will it interact with what other algorithms are doing? That's unknowable. We're in the realm of nighty and uncertainty. And that nighty and uncertainty has made people nervous enough about self-driving cars that they are testing them over and over and over again on the streets of Nevada and in Arizona, and Silicon Valley. You have the cars driving around, and the idea is there that they want to make sure that these cars anticipate every event that they can anticipate.
Right.
And there's no effort being made in that same way for finance. So I think we need to have more imagination, honestly, right, about what could go wrong. I think we need to start running sophisticated simulations of what could go wrong. Again, these won't be perfectly predictive, but just at least give us some kind of idea of the ways in which these things could interact. And then if we get some sort of simulations that we can sort of package into a data set, these kind of things are the things that machine learning algorithms need to be exposed to. Right? We don't want them to just think, well, the last few years were all well and good, so nothing's ever going to go wrong. They need to be exposed to historical problems, but not just historical problems, because the crises in the past didn't involve autonomous algorithmic decision making. So I think we're going to need to do war games and simulations and things like that to create at least some kind of a data set that evinces the possibility of things going sort of horribly wrong in a world where much of the decision making is made by algorithms.
Right. So in the past, when we have financial crises, it seems like there's a playbook of sorts. Some fellow in a suit, and it's almost always a fellow in a suit, comes out and talks to the market. Somebody from the Treasury or the Fed will come out and say things. Is that a language that can an algorithm hear that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So there's a lot of work that's being done by algorithms on semantics, right? They're sort of learning what words mean, learning to react to words before humans get a chance to react to words. And there's definitely a lot of interest in sort of what's known as Fed speak. When someone from the Federal Reserve, comes out and says something, what do they really mean? And algorithms are trying to learn what they really mean. But even if algorithms get very good at parsing Fed speak on interest rates, for example, small raises or, lowering interest rates. I'm not sure that they're going to have the opportunity to learn how to respond to the calming words that we hear from our central bankers in a crisis, which have been reasonably effective in lots of circumstances in at least tamping down on crises. I'm also not sure how algorithms will react to sort of emergency guarantee programs like bailouts and things like that. Will they, will they calm down when they see that the Federal Reserve has implemented, a guarantee fund for money market mutual funds or something like that? I really don't know. I think, again, because what we're talking about are tail events here, the communications that come from central bankers in those circumstances will again be so unusual and bespoke that the algorithms won't have learned how to sort of respond to them, that they are meant to calm down, that things will calm down. And perhaps they won't calm down in the future. We may have actually lost one of our major weapons to calm the markets after a crisis.
So what kind of weapons do we have under development? Like, is our regulatory infrastructure scaling up for this new challenge? Do we have, people who can really code and understand this in the regulatory space?
No, and this is something that makes me really nervous. And part of it's a resources issue. These people are in demand. If you know how to do artificial intelligence, if you know how to do data science, you can be paid a significant amount of money, and the government isn't really competitive in that space. I spoke to a former regulator and asked, what they found were challenges in terms of hiring in this space. And they said, the computer programming ability, it's hard to get those people, but the data scientists, it was impossible, that they couldn't afford these people.
Yeah. You're not going to get that with a GS13.
No. So unless frankly, we as a society commit to this, and say that we're really worried about this and this is something we're going to invest in, then I think this is a real problem. And this isn't just an issue in finance.
Right.
Across so many different spheres, healthcare, food production, things are being automated, and the regulatory state needs to, beef itself up to a place where it can actually grapple with this. Another issue, again, that this is kind of cross-cutting, is jurisdictional.
Right.
These new technologies don't fit neatly into the buckets of banking and securities that we're used to. And so a lot of what you're seeing right now in terms of regulators trying to deal with these new technologies is frankly squabbling over jurisdiction. And, unlike in the past where they often wanted jurisdiction, I often get the sense that no one wants to touch this stuff because it is, too hard and beyond what they sort of see as their typical area of competency. And that's happening not just at the national, but at the international level. Yeah. So I think there's reason to be worried that regulators are not responding to the threats that I've identified.
So it seems like we're at an inflection point or approaching an inflection point. There's, so technology is developing, and the way it develops is going to sort of lock in what our options are in the future. How do you sort of direct the development of technology in a way that helps us reduce these risks?
So I think you're right about the inflection point. I think if we don't do something very soon, we will have missed our chance. So if I haven't already depressed you enough, I'm going even further now, because there's both political economy and technological reasons why now is the time to act. So from a political economy perspective, once an industry becomes very established, once major market players have sort of adopted a technology, they don't want to change it. And regulators can find it very difficult to overcome that resistance.
Oh, yeah.
And also the technological aspect. If you are building these machine learning algorithms and they've learned from a data set, there's no way to go back and correct them or, tell them to unlearn a particular thing. You'd have to start from scratch, which again, contributes to the political economy issue. So now is the time to act. And I think what needs to be done, although I've got reasonably little hope that it will be done. And part of what I'm trying to do with this article is to get people worried, to try and build some kind of support for starting to do this. But regulators really need to be looking at the processes by which these technologies are being created. They need to get in sort of at the beginning. And one of the ways that they could do this is potentially being trialed by the regulatory sandbox model that we're seeing in some countries. So I'm not a huge fan of the regulatory sandbox in general, but one good thing about it is that you do have regulators and the industry working together from day one on building a technology. And that kind of partnership is what I think we need right now with these new technologies. So things that I've already talked about. Regulators being there on the ground floor to make sure that any machine learning algorithm is exposed to tail event scenarios. Or regulators being there on the ground for making sure that any sort of reputable financial asset that's represented by a smart contract has a circuit breaker built in there, or is hosted on a distributed ledger that can be forked reasonably easily. Those kind of things are what I think we need to see happening right away.
Yeah. So in finance, there's always this problem of, this is I'll be gone, you'll be gone, particularly in trading with scenarios or with an annual bonus culture. If you're looking at financial crises as things that happen every decade or so, I think there's an incentive perhaps for some folks to use some machine learning to put in an extraordinarily profitable trading strategy, which has enormous tail risk. But if they're getting their bonuses and cashing out and leaving the firm before the tail event occurs, are they, it seems like the system or of the way people make money in this space and then exit, it doesn't really take into account the damage that can affect all of us.
Well, that's a perennial issue in financial industry culture, and there are some initiatives that have been put in place, particularly by the Dutch National Bank, but also the Fed in New York and also the FCA in the UK. They're really trying to sort of work on this financial industry culture to make people more cognizant of the sort of the systemic impact of their decisions. Those are hard fought battles. I think they're important, but they are hard fought, trying to get the industry to change its culture. And I don't think algorithms are going to help. Right. There's all kinds of psychological literature out there on how people sort of can avoid any ethics involved with their decision if they can sort of fade the ethics out of their decision making, or they can basically sort of say, well, I don't need to behave well because the algorithm is doing the risk management. So if they can use the algorithm to be sort of the responsible agent, they don't have to feel bad about doing things that might hurt the economy at large. So I think these hard-fought battles to make the financial industry more cognizant of the fact that their risk-taking could have outsized externalities for the whole world. Oh, yeah. I think those are going to be set back even further as more and more decision-making goes to the algorithms. And so the actual humans who are involved in these processes can say, well, it wasn't me, it was the algorithm. I'm a good person.
Right. So we just know risks. People are there. People are going to keep taking them. And at some point, crises are going to happen again and again. How do we get ready for the next one? And then the next one and the next one as more and more of these decisions move online and become algorithmic? So
I guess there's a couple things that obviously I don't have an answer to that, or else I would be an extremely wealthy woman. But I have some sort of thoughts on it. First of all, I think something I'm worried about is that the actual frequency of crises might speed up. Okay. I was talking to a colleague recently and they said, I think we spend too much time working about financial crises. We may not see another one in our lifetime. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I'm not so sure about that, because I think with these technological, so something that Salih Maruma pointed out, which I think is really important, is the faster transactions are, the more room there is for more transactions. And then the more transactions you have, the more opportunities there are for something to go wrong.
Yeah.
So as we accelerate the financial transacting, I think we're opening up scope for more things to go wrong, which means I think we're going to start to see things being a little more frequent in terms of crises. I'm also worried because our standard playbook, and we've already talked a little bit about this in the aftermath of a financial crisis,
right,
is to, calm the markets, with emergency programs, lots of money coming in, calming words from central bankers. And I just don't know how algorithms are going to react to that. And frankly, those have been the major playbook for, over a century. Going back to Walter Bagehot about how to calm people down. And so the ex post, the after the fact calming down that we've relied on for so long may not be effective in the future, which means we have to focus on the harder part, which is the ex ante, which is how do we make the system a little safer from the get-go. And so that's what I would like to see our attentions focused on. And that's why I'm trying to scare as many people as possible about the rise of driverless finance.
Well, you've reached me, and I think we have to keep an eye on this. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
No, thank you, Ben.
He's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. He's America's automobile man, marching at the head of the band. He's leading the way to a brighter today, and he's doing all that he can.
All across America he's found his way to a place in our community. He's always smiling and singing his song about America and living free, helping you travel through this changing world, helping you get on your way. He's driving the highways of history, believing in today.
And he's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. He's America's automobile man, marching at the head of the band. He's leading the way to a brighter today, and he's doing all that he can.
Some folks think of him only in terms of new cars and weekend sales and next year's models, but there's really much more to his story. He's a real leader here in our community. He believes in the American way, and he's always one of the first to stand up and speak out about how it can be made even better. Yes, he's America's automobile man, and his business is just about as competitive as they come. I remember when he bought that old vacant lot down on the corner and moved his dealership into that new building he put up. I think you could say that he's made more than a sizable commitment and contribution to our city and the economy here. He has 70 people working for him now, and that's a lot of jobs. Some of his employees have been in the automobile business for over 25 years and probably know more about transportation and its future than a government investigating committee. He's proud of those people, too. Yes, he talks about them every day, just as if they were part of his own family. He's concerned about the role of transportation in America's future. Yes, he's come a long way since Henry Ford started it all, and I think that he can be trusted to keep America moving.
And he's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. He's America's automobile man. He's a neighbor, he's a friend. He's here to help, and he cares about the things that matter in the end. And he's keeping America moving, keeping keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. Yeah, he's America's automobile man. He's a neighbor, he's a friend. He's here to help, and he cares about the things